It's an all-inclusive luxury wellness retreat. His philosophy is that most people want to get better and are happy to participate in their road to getting well if they're simply informed, empowered, and inspired to do so. He works to help his patients navigate that road and provide therapies that will expedite the process as much as possible. So thank you, Dr. Derek, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll get this workshop going. I do want to start by taking an opportunity to thank all the essential workers out there. And this is everybody from, healthcare providers on the front lines. This is truck drivers. This is the people that we, interact with at the grocery store when we go and do our, grocery shopping. So, that's, as we can all see from, Dr. Haas's talk, the spread is there, the risk is there, and a lot of asymptomatic spread is there. And these folks are putting themselves at a, slightly elevated risk because of that. And so just if there's anybody out there that is one of these essential workers, all of us, thank you so much for that. You're doing a great service for all of us right now. And I'd like to speak a little bit to, how can we control aspects of our immune system? And particularly, if anybody knows me, I love talking about gut health. And so we're going to emphasize immune regulation through optimizing gut health and what kind of gut health actually means. And so we'll get into that. As Paul mentioned a little bit about myself, I have a naturopathic medical practice in Carlsbad. And then, yes, I'm the Director of Medicine at VeraVia, which is all-inclusive fitness and wellness retreat here in Carlsbad. My clinical practice tends to focus on gut health, cardiometabolic disease. This is kind of how I wrap up things like diabetes, heart disease, inflammatory issues all into one. And then some weight loss and longevity as well. If you guys are social folks, this is where you can find us and find VeraVia as well. So I'm going to jump right into this. So we're talking about gut health, and I want any of my colleagues on the video as well, for any reason where we got a bad feed or anything like that, let me know. But gut health means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and there's a lot of functions that our digestive tract has, and we can argue it kind of begins here with the mouth and ends in the back end. But from an immune standpoint, we're going to hit on some kind of major functions that the digestive tract has. One is with its digestive capacity. And so meaning that is like, how do we break down our food, hydrochloric acid, bile, but how they participate in keeping our immune system kind of regulated and healthy. We're going to talk a little bit about the intestinal barrier. And how literally the lining of the GI tract is arguably one of the most important interfaces in our body. And then how our GI tract and immune system interact with each other through not only directly, but also through the microbiome, which are the bugs that inhabit our small and large intestine. This is a little summary of what we're going to jump into. And you'll see, actually, I wanted to bring this back to Dr. Haas's talk, to Corey's talk. She mentioned IgA, immune globulin A. We're actually going to hit a little bit on that today, because I am also kind of the belief that a kind of strong and robust and balanced secretory immune globulin A kind of response is important, and probably a component as to why some people are going to maybe get a greater, more severe infection than other folks. All right. So first off, we'll talk about hydrochloric acid. And you'll see in this picture in the background, there's just this fire. I put this in there because hydrochloric acid, I often talk to my patients about it. being our digestive fire, our ability to break down our food, proteins, fats, etc. Well, one of the unique lenses to look at hydrochloric acid through, or stomach acid, is its role in actually killing bacteria, in ingested pathogens. So, from a COVID-19 lens, you could look at this through, if there's contamination on food or anything that we're putting into our body. Hydrochloric acid is this kind of barrier that has the capacity to break down pathogens. So a couple of journal articles here, but or referencing that, why hydrochloric acid is kind of relevant is because it's one of the first what would we call it? Maybe soldiers at the front line of being able to set the stage for a optimal gut, not only through the ability to kick the crap out of some bacteria and infectious organisms, but it also sets the stage for an appropriate pH or acid kind of base balance in the GI tract. And we know that the different microbes kind of in our gut and the different locations in our GI tract all have different pHs. They have different acidities, and certain bacteria are going to grow better. Microbes are going to grow better in one versus another. And I will say that we have a chronic problem with low HCl in our society. This is for a host of reasons. We can see it suppressed by PPIs, these are proton pump inhibitors, other like acid blocking medications. Chronic stress will inhibit and lower hydrochloric acid. Okay, we call this a condition called hypochlorhydria, or the very kind of severe version of that is called achlorhydria, which is no stomach acid. There's a common gut infection called H. pylori or Helicobacter pylori. It's a bacterial infection of the stomach, and it will actually suppress stomach acid production and cause a lot of gastric inflammation. Low thyroid function, which we have a real big problem with in our society, will influence hydrochloric acid production. Then autoimmune disease can as well. I will say the one that I see probably participating the heaviest is chronic stress, right? Which is why, like in this particular time where we're kind of living in a slightly chaotic world right now, that doesn't stop your heartburn. That doesn't, just because, we have this kind of exacerbated, viral ecosystem, it doesn't stop your irritable bowel syndrome. It doesn't stop your Crohn's disease. It doesn't stop your reflux. And in fact, it can make a lot of them worse. And so, I find that this time is more relevant than ever to be able to start to understand, assess, and treat these types of conditions, because they also are going to play a role in your immunity. And that's what we kind of tended to focus a lot of our telehealth consults on, are one, making sure our patients are healthy right now, and how do we kind of keep them healthy, and gut health is an avenue. So hydrochloric acid is part of this digestive fire that helps keep our immune system regulate, and actually keeps pathogen load low. One of the other components is bile. And this is a less popular or less well-known kind of component of our digestive juices. But this is made by our liver, stored in the gallbladder if you have one, okay, and then secreted from the gallbladder into the small intestine. You can see the picture at the bottom left there. The common bile duct joins up with the pancreas and then dumps into the small intestine, or that's the tube. So bile also has microbial and antibacterial properties to it. And so we need an appropriate amount of bile being secreted routinely while we are, while we're eating in particular, because our gallbladder secretes in response to fat. Okay, so bile serves a lot of different purposes. It has a kind of detoxification purpose. It has a digestive purpose. And I will argue it has an immunological purpose here as well, as we can see that it significantly will kind of improve the microbial ecosystem in the gut. And again, another kind of common condition is reduced bile secretion. And this goes back to hydrochloric acid, because in fact, hydrochloric acid is actually one of the important steps in the cascade of digestion. So the low HCl will actually inhibit proper bile secretion. So digestion is this beautiful cascade. And we can argue it starts when we see, when we smell, when we touch food. All right. The next step is this saliva and chewing, right? Actual mastication of our food. Then it dumps into our stomach, where there's hydrochloric acid, into our small intestine, where there's bile and pancreatic enzymes. And so if we don't have an appropriate cascade before, we don't get those secondary and tertiary steps. So chewing, smelling, touching, important parts of our digestive tract, and of course to secrete appropriate amounts of bile. Stress, again, will inhibit this. Poor quality bile and gallbladder obstruction. So gallbladder obstruction, this can happen when there's sluggish bile, stones in the gallbladder as well. Poor quality bile, this can speak a little bit to the toxic load in our body. So we talked about bile having a kind of a detoxification mechanism. And so one of the things that it does is as our liver and our hepatocytes are kind of working to filter our blood, one of the places that all that junk goes is actually in our bile, and our bile secretes in the small intestine. We bind some of it up and we eliminate it through the stool. So high toxic loads, poor bile kind of production, which has a little bit to do with some of the liver enzymes in our or the enzymes, I should say, in our hepatocytes. There can be some genetic variants that leave people susceptible to this as well. So, the beautiful thing about both of these is there's actionable steps. One, stress management. But two, there are other things in a kind of nutraceutical herbal realms that can help promote hydrochloric acid production, help promote better bile and even more bile secretion. This is where like our bitter herbs come into play, and they may not taste fantastic, but they work well. So the next thing we want to talk about is that's a digestive fire that helps kind of regulate the microbial ecosystem that's, and potentially pathogenic load that's coming into our body, and also regulates the internal ecosystem to create a pH that is desirable or not, depending on if we have optimal functioning. The next is the barrier. And a lot of folks have heard of things like leaky gut. And we're going to talk just briefly about that today, but this picture is beautiful. It speaks to the enterocytes there on the left-hand side. You can see that these right here, pardon me, these are the intestinal cells. And there's really one lining of enterocytes between the tube of the intestine, the stuff that the food and kind of pathogens are in, and then what in this picture is labeled as the lamina propria, but where our immune system lies. And so we have different cells that line our intestines, our Panna cells, goblet cells, etc. Dendritic cells stick their little legs out there as well. And then you can see secretory IgA. So this is a beautiful kind of understanding of some of the different kind of components of our intestinal barrier here. And this is not only a physical barrier, but it also is in a kind of an immunological barrier. And we're going to jump into both of those. But we know that kind of loss of integrity of the intestinal barrier, or like leaky gut, is necessary to develop autoimmunity. This has been studied in numerous journal articles, and it's one thing that we look at commonly in autoimmune patients in our practice. And then, another aspect of this is actually allergies and food allergies as well. And that it kind of an impaired intestinal barrier is going to leave us more susceptible to food allergies and adverse reactions to food and food sensitivity. So they may not necessarily be overt allergies, but they can be reactivity to certain foods. And, we could have a whole nother conversation about the kind of various ways in which one can react to foods. And so this question comes up often in my practice, is like, oh, well, should I do food sensitivity testing, eliminate all those foods forever and ever? Well, no, I don't always blame the food. I don't blame the food first. I think looking at what foods we may be reacting to are kind of like salt in the wound, right? They can exacerbate it. But as we can see from here, the gastric barrier, the intestinal barrier, is a huge component of like why we may be overreactive to specific foods. And so we see this condition of increased intestinal permeability in infections, or, you know, this word called dysbiosis is basically like dysfunction in the microbiome, lowered immune system function, mycotoxins, which are related with mold, environmental toxins. These are chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, etc. Okay, food allergies, sensitivities, they can perpetuate this immune barrier issue. Reduced commensal bacteria, commensal being like the bugs that we really kind of want in your GI tract, that are there to keep the peace, to keep regulation. Chronic stress, booze, that'll exacerbate it as well. And so the reason why we're kind of talking about these issues is that because from an acute standpoint, right, the intestinal barrier, our digestive fire, these are some of the, you know, first and second steps of common exposure routes to bacteria, to viruses, to parasites, right? And so it doesn't exclude, you know, our kind of COVID-19 existence, that these barriers and these aspects of our immunological functioning are incredibly important. And the next thing we're going to talk about, which has to do with our kind of direct immune regulation, we'll kind of explain why. And we'll jump into talking about secretory IgA. Corianne talked about immune globulin A already as a measured response to a measured antibody response to COVID-19. Secretory IgA is a particular type of IgA that is secreted from the mucosal cells in the body. Mucosa, like the mucosal linings, are your intestinal tract. You also see this in the nose, in the sinuses, in the throat. Okay, you'll see IgA on the skin, vaginal canal, anywhere there's mucosa, you can see that as well. And IgA's job, they're the soldiers at the front line, right? So they are literally like immune cells at the interface where we are exposed to things, right? And so we know that the routes of exposure for COVID are, you know, nose, eyes, mouth, right? Aerosolized particles, right? Those are where we tend to get those, or on our skin that we then touch our face with. So our secretory IgA response and our ability to respond appropriately with secretory IgA, incredibly important. Okay, incredibly important. And this last mark on here, this promote oral tolerance, not particularly COVID related, but oral tolerance has to do with, you know, like, are we going to respond negatively to broccoli? Right? Tolerance to certain foods. So this is kind of the overall like immune, like food allergy, food sensitivity aspect of like, how do we make sure that we don't over kind of respond to things that we're not really supposed to respond to? And so this is just a picture kind of showing a little bit about how IgA is formed in the intestine. Here's our enterocytes again. And you'll see there's this beautiful mucus layer in the lining of the GI tract. H. pylori, which we talked about before, breaks down this mucus layer. Okay, so this mucus layer, you can see all sorts of little rectangles, circles, and squiggles. These are designed to represent microbes, different bacteria, good and maybe a pathogenic. But they live in this mucosal layer. We want this mucosal layer. This is where our commensal bacteria exist. And so you can see here that this microbiota can modulate IgA synthesis and secretion, and that simultaneously we can see that IgA can influence the diversity and composition of our microbiota. So it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg scenario, which I think is kind of beautiful and frustrating at the same time, right? And then we can see our IgA, which is this little purple person-looking thing, pops out through our intestinal linings, and this is where it can react and grab onto bacteria and grab onto other microbes here. This is, so as I mentioned before, secretory IgA is something that I look at a lot of my patients. You can test for this. You can test for all just overall immune globulin production. And this, maybe an adjunct to Dr. Haas's talk. when we're talking about COVID-19 antibody testing, right? IgM, IgG, IgA, and looking for positive responses or negative responses in them. I think a good question to ask is, well, do we produce enough of these antibodies, period? Like enough of these immune globulins, period? Because remember, on these COVID-19 tests and some of the stuff that we look at, these are antibody responses to a specific kind of component of these microbes. So, say we have IgA to COVID-19. Well, if say we have a low IgA to COVID-19, we go like, okay, well, I don't have any IgA to that. Are we producing enough IgA to even respond to that? That's an important question. And this is where just like overall general antibody testing can be valuable, because we see this in some folks where they're actually immunosuppressed, not in like a, HIV type way, which we know where like we, drop down our ability to respond significantly, right? Or on, immunosuppressive medication way, but just kind of functionally immunosuppressed, where they don't produce enough IgM, produce enough IgA, produce enough IgG. And thus, if we measure their antibodies, they actually may not respond high, even though they potentially have been kind of exposed to this. If anybody's got any questions about that, that might be, we can clarify that. But it's not uncommon in my practice to see low secretory IgA. This is often reflected in a kind of suppressed and exhausted immune system from chronic infections and chronic inflammation. It's basically your soldiers at the front line, they're running out of gas. There's been something going on for a long period of time, a chronic stressor on the body, potentially inflammatory or infectious, or really both. Even nutritionally can happen too. Where we just kind of lack the ability to properly respond. This is going to leave us potentially susceptible to infection, not only of bacteria, but parasites, viruses, etc. As we know, we respond with IgAs to viral infections, to COVID and other things like that. So, and we have IgA not just in the gut, in the nose, in the mouth. These are all in the mucosal layers. I want those soldiers at the front line strong, right? I want them kicking ass of whatever microbes they are exposed to, because guess what? As Dr. Haas talked to, we are being exposed, whether we know it or not. We can also see high secretory IgA. That happens. Usually this is when you catch an acute inflammatory reaction, acute infectious. This is a kind of unregulated hyperactive immune system response, and you'll see this in acute inflammation, acute infections, acute reactions, food reactions as well. In the case of this type of infectious ecosystem, I'm a little bit more concerned about the kind of chronic low suppressed IgA and making people more susceptible to infections. And last but certainly not least, we're going to talk about T regulators, T-reg cells. Okay. These are specific immune cells that are responsible for immune homeostasis. I'm going to go back to this picture, and I do have to give a shout out to my gal who does my marketing. Her name is Kelly Carnahan, and she makes some kick-ass background social media posts and just some images for me. I have no capacity to do any of this. And she does some wonderful stuff. We actually have a whole series on T-reg cells on the blog on docderek.com and on our social. So if you want to see more fun pictures and other ways to navigate the T-regulatory mechanisms, they're on the website and you can check it out. But these are specific immune cells that are responsible for kind of keeping immune homeostasis in the body. They're crucial in chronic infections and inflammation. Okay, as kind of named, they are regulators, right? They regulate the immune system responses. They stop them from getting overreactive and exaggerated, and we're going to talk about that in COVID, and can help, promote a sufficient enough kind of immunological reaction as well. One of the things you can see here, they're in charge of suppressing potentially deleterious activities of our T helper cells in our body. And so some of the suggested functions for these are things like prevention of autoimmune disease, maintaining, our ability to distinguish our own tissue from things that we're supposed to react to. Suppression of allergies and asthma. Basically being able to lower the reactivity to environmental insults, and suppression of pathogen and induced immunopathology. This one particularly relevant in some of the cases of COVID-19 and overall just reaction to microbial ecosystems or to microbes, viruses, etc. One of the things that we get that's causing poor responses or poor outcomes in COVID-19 is this what's called cytokine storm, where it's the immune system's response and all the inflammatory byproducts that come with that that's overwhelming the capacity of our body to kind of handle all of that, right? So this is this pathogen-induced immunopathology. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Couple other things: fetal-maternal tolerance, so basically keeping mom's immune system from attacking a fetus if there's something in there, and then oral tolerance, which we talked about as well, tolerance to things like foods. So these are regulatory T cells in red. This is from electron microscopy. I love looking at our immune cells and just kind of get an understanding of what they actually look like. It's artwork through some lens. So this is why T regulatory cells are relevant and are important, particularly in COVID-19, is that, in this first point, you can see the asterisks there. This was a study on coronavirus, but not specifically COVID-19, but COVID-19 is a coronavirus. And that it seemed that like Treg cells protected against more serious forms of coronavirus infection. Again, kind of keeping a lid on that overreactive immune system response. And these ones were actually specifically, there's one at the bottom here specifically about COVID-19 and the fact that it seemed that patients with COVID-19, particularly the more worse outcomes, had lower levels of regulatory T cells. And this is, you can see 2020, March 12th. This is out of some studies of the patients in Wuhan province in China. And we talked about it, the immunosuppressive effects. Again, immunosuppression is not a bad thing necessarily, as it can, kind of keep a lid on the cytokine storm, the cytokine release syndrome that happens in these inflammatory issues. Here's a little picture, Tregs on the left here, and how they participate in regulating autoimmunity, cytokine release syndrome, and infection. As well. And so a good question to ask yourself, and I don't have the answer to this, but is your gut working for you or working against you? This is where I get to look, where testing can be relevant and important. But one of the things that we like to talk about when we are discussing secretory IgA and Tregs are what are called short chain fatty acids. Why you need them, how they keep you healthy, and how to get more of them. Short chain fatty acids are like byproducts that the bugs in your gut make for you. Okay, so they basically take soluble fiber from your diet and they ferment it, and they produce these three major short chain fatty acids: butyrate, propionate, and acetate. This is what they look at from a biochemical standpoint. But these short chain fatty acids are they support the production of T regulatory cells and secretory IgA in our body. So a short extrapolation is, soluble fiber from fruits, vegetables, etc., incredibly important in actually getting our gut to start working for us. I think the best practice for gut health is to look at what's going on in there. Look at what's going and growing in there. You can look at digestive function. Protein breakdown, fat breakdown. You can look at markers of barrier integrity, markers of infection, inflammation. You can even look at short chain fatty acid production. I think that's incredibly important. And you can look at secretory IgA levels. Treg cell levels are not really something we can look at clinically, but we can look at things like IgA production and short chain fatty acid production. It's not a huge leap to say like, well, if our butyrate levels are low, if our short chain fatty acid production is low, it wouldn't be shocking if our kind of T regulatory function is less than optimal. These are some of the tests that I love to look at. These are ones that I run with my patients in my practice. And we consult on them all the time. I won't go into all of them in detail, but some of them may be familiar to some of you. And if they aren't, you can ask myself, you can ask Corey. I know both of us are pretty familiar with those. And so I never like to leave a presentation without action steps, right? Because we sit here saying, well, we don't necessarily have all the answers, but what we're trying to do is ask the right questions, right? That's what Dr. Haas is talking about, asking the right questions. What is our immune status? What I'm trying to do, how is your gut? Is your gut working for you? And then we have action steps on like what we can do about that. So you can get tested. You can avoid some potentially harmful medications if possible. Acid blockers, NSAIDs, aspirin, antibiotics, put a caveat there. If you need antibiotic therapy, it's take it, but know that it comes with its consequences. So try to minimize those as much as possible. Practice stress management techniques. We've already had Jen talk a little bit about how we can do that. Chew your food. It's the first step in digestion. Make sure we're emphasizing a plant passionate diet. And if any of these things are confusing to you, work with a pro who knows what they're talking about as it pertains to gut health. A couple of pros, myself and colleague, Dr. Brian Myers, shameless plug for our clinic, but we're doing teleconsults right now. And they're taking new patients, taking our returns, and focusing a lot on how do we keep our patient base healthy. If you're not sure if that's right for you, this is our kind of virtual health summit offer that we're giving out to folks, and we're doing basically 3 free 30-minute health explorations. This won't be medical advice, but what it can be is an understanding of what are some important kind of rocks to turn over in your case. So, and that's what we're pros at. And then of course, being able to provide some actionable steps on what to do. So feel free to reach out to us and contact us there. That's all I have for you. For anybody who was paying attention and tuning in, really appreciate it. And I will open this up to questions if there's any on Facebook Live, or any from my fellow, colleagues here. Let me check our Facebook Live stream here. Stop sharing that, and I'm back here. There was a question here, so I have IgA deficiency.
So, Dr. Derek, can you hear me okay?
I can now, yeah.
Dr. Derek, can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Okay, cool. So I've got actually I've got 3 questions from you from Facebook.
Okay.
The first question is, what's your opinion on using metabolic/digestive enzymes?
Yeah, they're not all created equally. That's one thing that I like to talk to patients about is that digestive enzymes are this big overarching umbrella. And it can mean a lot of different things. It can mean pancreatic enzymes. It can mean plant enzymes like bromelain and papain, right? It is from fruits. It could mean hydrochloric acid. It could mean bile. So there's a lot of different ones that are out there, and I will use them frequently. My goal is to try to use them in a shortened period of time. I don't love reliance on them in the grand scheme of things, but I find for a lot of folks, especially when there's high levels of stress and they have compromised digestion, that it is a almost necessary step, because as you can see, this poor digestion is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy for dysfunction later in the gut. And while the grand scheme of things may be resolving an infection, maybe getting rid of SIBO, maybe working on chronic stress, there is a time and a place to just start to action on these things. Which one I will choose is highly dependent on the particular patient. So give you an example of this. So for someone who has maybe gastritis, I'm probably not going to use an enzyme that has a lot of hydrochloric acid in it, because that would be like pouring acid in a wound, and it can really flare folks up. But simultaneously, I'm not going to use necessarily bromelain or papain if I'm really trying to increase their gallbladder secretion or their bile production. So it's dependent on the case, and I use them frequently in my practice, but I try to always look at that through the lens of how do we use them for a therapeutic purpose for a therapeutic period of time to accomplish a goal.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Derek. I've got, I know one of our doctors have a question, but let me get to the Facebook, our audience first. Someone had a question about, and feel free if you want to pass this on to someone else, or if you want to answer this, it's about 5G. So this is a very hot topic lately, the exposure of 5G, as it has the potential for radiation exposure and how that might affect the gut.
Sure. I will soft pass that off to anybody else on our panel that maybe has a little bit more education on that. I'm undereducated about its specifics on gut and gut health at this particular point in time. It's on the list of things to better understand, but it's a little bit outside of the framework of what I can speak to today.
Yeah, totally understand. Let me just give you this other question then, and if there's if one of the other practitioners want to answer that question later, we'll save it for later. This question I think is a little more relevant for what you were talking about, which is this patient says, or this person rather has IgA deficiency. She's been told she has IgA deficiency.
Yeah. And
that she cannot increase it. And she's wondering, from your perspective and your opinion, is that true? Is it not true?
Well, so there's a host of reasons why one can have either selective IgA deficiency or multiple immune globulin deficiencies. So the things that I have found relevant, because I have a few patients with this, not only the IgA, but also IgM and IgGs as well. And they get sick all the time. Every single microbe, flu, sinus infection, cold, they get it. So the things that need to be looked at, one, gut health is probably top of the list. Okay, sleep, top of the list. These are two huge immune modulating components of our life. Okay, those two things. If you're not sleeping and your gut's a mess, they have to be dialed in. The next level of understanding on that front, okay, what has the capacity to suppress immunological function? Mycotoxins and mold, chronic infections, heavy metals, environmental exposures, pesticides, chemicals, etc. So those are all things that can be understood and evaluated in these cases that are important to look at. Again, and the hope is that, well, one, you find something to be able to anchor to. So the gut's a mess, the sleep is a mess, or there's a high load of mycotoxins. Okay, well, the goal is to say, like, well, if we find these things, how do we action on them? And then what type of response do we see in the body? Because the reasons why folks present with certain things are varied. And, if anyone can sit there and say, I know exactly why people get IgA deficiency, I probably need to talk to them, but I don't think that there's a reality. I don't think there's actually a true answer to that question, because I think it's very dependent. And you need to look at these variables. And I found, like, from a functional medicine standpoint, that is the starting ground. And it's actually pretty broad, because there's a lot to look at that can kind of suppress immune function. On the flip side of that too, not only from looking at, well, what is potentially dampening it, or lowering the ability to produce immune globulin, are there also therapeutics that we can do, that we can take, et cetera, that help promote? And that's the other side of the equation, right? So there's the investigation as to what might be dampening the immune system response, but then also, like, what can we use from a therapeutic standpoint to kind of help elevate and regulate that immune response? T-regs, secretory IgA, immune kind of stimulating therapeutics. And I know myself and Dr. Haas have a few of these in our toolbox. So.
Great, thanks, Dr. Derek. I know Dr. Corey has a question, so Dr. Corey, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, I've been unmuted.
Make it a softball, Corey. Make it a lob.
I'm not allowed to show my video, though, apparently. Paul's blocking me. That was great. I'd like to talk with you more about IgA. My question is, how are you evaluating people's stomach acid production? What's your best tool for that?
That's a good question. That's a really good question, because there are a few tests out there. Like I would say the gold standard for this is what's called the Heidelberg test. And this is like legit looking at, it's a test that will evaluate the pH of your stomach. Clinically, I don't have the capacity to do that. I don't find it particularly easy to do. It's a procedure. You can tell a lot of this from symptoms. One of the unique pieces of the Genova GI effects test is that you can actually see products of protein breakdown in the stool panel. And so from that, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but you can infer a little bit. If we're seeing high levels of protein left in their stool, you can get a sense that they're not breaking it down and absorbing it, into their amino acids and absorbing it well enough on that front. So that's like one kind of objective measurement that I've been that I anchor to. I will say like reflux is a real common one as well. And because a lot of folks think, oh, I have reflux, I have GERD, heartburn, it's too much stomach acid. Clinically speaking, most of the time these cases are low stomach acid production. The explanation of that is a little complicated and probably another 15-minute talk, so I won't go into it. But reflux and GERD is another common one. Undigested food in the stool is another kind of hint that something might be going on that front. And of course, if they have H. pylori. If they have H. pylori, most of the time their stomach acid is suppressed. H. pylori thrives in a kind of alkaline environment. And so that you can test for. You can test that at Quest, at LabCorp, Genova, whatever. It's just, and there's other ways to do that. So you can almost guarantee they're going to have poor stomach acid production if they have H. pylori. Granted, complicated situation, because you don't just want to dump stomach acid into an H. pylori system, because they often have gastritis.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome. So Dr. Derek, Jake has a question for you. He's going to go ahead and unmute himself and ask his question.
Sounds good.
Yes.
Hey, Jake.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for all that information. I was like, whoa, very mind-opening.
Cool.
So I just have a quick question about like getting tests done for the gut. Are there simple at-home tests that can be ordered, or are there, do people actually have to go in to a practice to get these types of tests?
Yeah, great question. I don't want to be anywhere near your stool.
Okay.
Okay, I don't want anywhere near it. That's on you. So all the gut tests are basically at-home collections. Pretty much. There are some serum tests that can give us some gut insight, and obviously that needs a blood draw. But the major ones I use testing for SIBO, the Genova GI effects, the GI map from Diagnostic Solutions. Love these tests. They're all at-home stool collections that you collect a sample, scoop it, prepaid FedEx envelope that's included with it. You kind of put it in the tube, you send it in. And that allows us to actually be able to do a lot of good work from a distance, be able to do a lot of good work without you having to come into an office. Like Dr. Haas said, probably shouldn't go into a lot of offices because they're underprepared. Hers obviously not, or obviously she is prepared. That's what I was trying to get across. But a lot of folks aren't. And so luckily we can drop ship all these. You can collect them on home court, send them in. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to see anything. And then we get the results and talk about them.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. Good question.
Okay. We've got another question from Brian.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brian. Unmute yourself.
Hi, Dr. Derek.
Hey.
My question, thank you again for all that information. As an infant, I was given tetracycline, and I'm told that kind of messes with your stomach lining.
Sure.
Are there, my understanding is there are some foods, and I know you said something about nutraceuticals. What can you say to that?
Yeah.
There's people that know that they may have something going on and rebuilding the stomach lining.
Right. So first off, for the folks listening, tetracycline, antibiotic, and antibiotics can, especially repeated use of them, can just kick the crap out of our gut, and the kind of commensal normal flora that's there. So nutraceuticals kind of span the gamut. There's everything from our probiotics and our prebiotics, and there are certain herbs that are helpful at kind of replenishing and normalizing the gut flora. You can take short chain fatty acids. We talked about butyrate and these various different short chain fat. You can actually take them nutritionally, and we'll use that commonly because I found it's a nice catalyst for helping grow the abundance of the abundance of flora. Sometimes you have to get rid of some pathogenic, dysfunctional microbial growth that is there, to kind of normalize the ecosystem, or yeast, which is another thing that we could talk about. But from a food standpoint, I've found that the most important piece, and this is in the literature over and over again, the most important piece is soluble fiber that helps feed the the microbes that live in our colon that then produce short chain fatty acids for us. So while I'm not going to sit up here and say everybody needs to only eat plants, I'm personally not a vegan. I don't think any people need to be necessarily. I don't have any problems with people being them as long as they're healthy. But plant passionate existing, I found important for my patients, particularly as it pertains to their overall gut health, and short chain fatty acid production on that front. So the nutraceutical question is a little broad. There's a lot of different things that can be helpful. I will say some of the common ammunition that we use. We actually use immune globulins often. So, or colostrum as well as another one of those, or serum immune globulins. These actually help kind of regulate the immunological system in there. We'll use butyrate, we'll use short chain fatty acids if needed. And then I'll often turn to a prebiotic fiber supplement, kind of as like jet fuel, for the microbial ecosystem to grow its abundance, and targeted probiotic use, but it depends on the person. Depends on the person. Sorry if I froze there.
They got you on a good frame at least.
Okay, good. All right, Paul, I think that's all I got for you.
All right, awesome. I think that's all the questions for you for now.
Great.
We're monitoring Facebook and writing down all the questions. There's a few that are going to be more relevant later. But let's go ahead and move on to so thank you, Dr. Derek. And let's move on to our next presenter. And that will be Brian Miller. He's a holistic psychologist. His presentation is going to be evolving in relationship through stressful times. Brian is a modern mystic spiritual teacher, relationship counselor, author, and nature vision quest guide. His work integrates the essence of the great wisdom traditions, scientific knowledge, and his own personal experience. For 20 years, Brian has been counseling and leading workshops. He's currently developing a year-long training program and online courses. Brian has devoted his life to the task of exploring consciousness, supporting others in their quest for greater awareness. He's also a graduate of the University of Santa Monica Master's Program in Spiritual Psychology in 2002. Please welcome Brian Miller. Thanks, Brian. The floor is yours. Okay, so looks like we lost Brian for just a moment there. Here you go. Give you something to look at. Hi, Facebook. So while we're waiting for Brian to get back on, because we definitely want to hear what he has to say. Dr. Corey, if you can hear me, I've got a couple of questions that I think are relevant to something that you spoke about in your presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. So somebody had posted this question, which was referring to the stick antibody test. Is it relevant as it only shows if the patient has antibodies or not?
So you'll need to have somebody that knows how to read that to make it relevant and correlate it with a clinical picture. But there are some, drive-through antibody tests where they're giving you quick results, and they may be lumping IgM and IgG together. And that's kind of a dangerous thing because you don't know if you just have memory immunity or if you have an active case. So you want, if you're going to get an antibody test, you want to ask to look at a sample result. So I showed you some sample results from the one that I'm running, where you get all 12 of those data points. I think, a knowledgeable clinician would be able to read something like that and give you some really good actionable advice. But there are tests out there that I think they just rush to market to try to make some money, that aren't going to give you the most actionable information. So I hope that answered the question.
Corey, could I ask you a question on that front too?
Did that make sense? Yeah, sure.
It goes back to what I was commenting on like the low secretory IgA, and of course like I won't say like the validity, but basically like the validity of these results in folks who actually might have poor IgG, IgM, IgA production as a whole, is like, do you see that like maybe running those immune globulins side by side being kind of a relevant test, so that we can, when you get those results back saying like maybe those complete negative people, how many of them, and again, it's not hugely common, but it's possible, how many of them don't actually have enough IgG or IgM to flag a qualitative response?
Great question. Yeah, that was something that came up to me in the beginning, because I was really surprised to find so many people just negative across the board. And most of them were really surprised because they'd had these very suspicious illnesses in the winter and fall months. So speaking with people about that, it sounds like if you were like legitimately unable to mount an immune response, you would probably not have survived COVID-19. Does that make sense? So, I think that, I don't have a great understanding of it myself, but I think that made a lot of sense to me. Like that would be somebody who would be in the ICU. It wouldn't be someone like, I had a horrible cough and now I'm okay.
Yeah.
But that being said, that is an open-ended question, like that whole negative thing, like how much can we trust those results based on that negative predictive value? I think we can trust them pretty well. But yeah, everyone's going to have a different response. And I think we're going to learn a lot of information by running this test. And we're still just in the beginning of it. So
totally. Yeah. Well, thanks for running it.
Waiting longer, I think we'll understand it better. What's that?
Thanks for running it.
Oh, yeah. My pleasure. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I want to know what's going on as much as everybody else. So.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for asking that question. So I haven't gotten Brian back on, but I've got one more question for Dr. Corey.
You should do Jake.
Yeah. And if you want to answer this now or later, but somebody was asking how much are your tests that you're running? How much do you charge?
So the Vibrant COVID-19 immune check test itself is $149. Most people will probably be charging between $200 and $300 to do the test and interpret it for you. Through our office, we're charging $220. So that includes basically my assistant setting up the test for you, getting your information, ordering it, it goes to your house, you collect it, shipping is included, and then you get a call afterwards to go over the results. I think my colleagues at AMA Skincare in Irvine are running the test for $250, and that includes the blood draw, which is a pretty good deal. So if people want to do it right away, not have to wait for the finger stick version, but then again, you are actually going into the clinic and having the blood drawn, and then you yourself will collect a finger stick. So that's how that works.
Corey, what's the timeline for the finger prick? 3 weeks, ballpark?
We're hoping for soon, early this week, as early as tomorrow. They actually submitted the application to the FDA on the 5th, and they were told that the FDA could take up to 15 days to respond to that. So I don't think it'll be much later than the 20th. Okay. I really expect it's going to get approved.
And is that the finger prick?
So sometime soon.
Alone?
And what I'm telling people is just if they want the test, Yeah, so that's the reason we're doing the serum and the finger stick is because it's the external FDA evaluation. They want to make sure that the finger stick itself is accurate. Yeah. And so as soon as the FDA gives the green light, it will be just the finger stick. So right now, it's kind of one nice thing about it is that you can really believe your results. Because I was kind of like, did these results get mixed up? It's like, I'm writing on the tube the patient's information. They're writing on the finger stick thing. There's 2 separate samples going in. It's like, there's no possible way it could get mixed up. So that's one thing that kind of helped me wrap my mind around these results. Like, these are really real. I can't deny, like, they didn't just mix up this husband and this wife, for example.
Right. All right. That's great. Yeah. So that I'll ping you for a heads up on that finger prick, because that's certainly something that I know a lot of folks are going to want to be able to do, especially at home. So great. Thank you.
Great. Yeah.